But the only thing that's a little bit still can't fully get behind, and I'm sure they'll at least try and explain it, is the veil. It still just seems a bit like shoehorned in. The fact you've got obviously the Traveler and the Witness. The Witness has obviously been changed a little bit, but it's still, the pyramids is also ancient. Like 2012 GDC, they showed off, the pyramids and the black body with the white head, which is what turned out to be the Witness. But the veil is like this thing which is, okay, it's supposed to be as important as the Traveler, yet we only heard about it for the first time in year 9. So it's kind of like trying to be like, oh yeah, the veil is as important. It's the counterpart to the Traveler. It's as important, but you've only just heard about it in Lightfall in a very bad way. It wasn't introduced very well. So anytime they bring up the veil, it's just a bit like, okay, I still don't even understand what the veil is. And even if you try and explain it, it still just kind of should have been, we can obviously talk in shoulda, coulda, woulda, but the veil is just like, oh yeah, and the veil too is also trying to make us believe it's as important as the Traveler, but it's hard to believe that when the Traveler has obviously been built so well over a decade, and the veils is been out for a couple months, and it's just apparently as important as the Traveler.
Yeah, I think I'd say this too. It's satisfying to a small extent, even with that poison pill of this should have been in Lightfall, to know at least why the veil is important to this equation, even if we don't quite understand what it is, The Witness wants the veil so it can make the portal so it can go and accomplish what it wants from the final shape. Like, at least having that base thread of logic to it, even if we just had that in Lightfall, I think the rest of it could have remained a mystery, and you could have sprinkled in the different bits and pieces. I honestly sit here and I think if we'd at least been given the context of this is why the veil is important, it would have been salvageable. Because honestly, there are so many different bits and pieces where Lightfall's questions and stories could have actually been mysteries that you might have wanted to unfold, and they could have been something that could have fitted. But it's that lack of a complete coherent story that really sort of like grinds it down to this point of, well, we're nowhere. That's the real frustration for it. I'd also say the veil what we've learned about the veil thus far, and all the lore stuff that has presented itself over the last bits, and the sort of the notes and the books that we get from even just like the veil missions that we've been getting every single week, all of those have started to build a really fascinating story, and the idea of what the veil is tantalizing. But I'm not going to lie, there are some really awesome potential ideas that could fall out of it, and I really hope they keep running in a good direction with it. It's just, even now, 8 or 9 weeks in, it's still very much uncertain as to how this thing lands, We have started getting some really important details. Things such as how Nimbus is partly built from a modified version of Siva's nanites that's influenced by Vex components, and how every Cloud Strider is technically like is a cyborg human hybrid Vex. Like, that's a big deal. That's no small thing. But then there's also the other bits in between where you're sitting there and you're learning about what the Neomuni did with the first few people that truly interacted with the veil, and how Maya Sundaresh and Chioma Essie's relationship is really starting to deteriorate because like there are some scary threads here. I can't help but emphasize that if they keep picking up this pace in direction, it's going to be good. But if we just sort of like don't see much more movement, it's still going to feel like it hasn't completely landed, and that's honestly the worst thing that could happen to the story at the moment. They need a really solid conclusion on that veil storyline, and maybe they get it, maybe they don't. It's too early to tell, even 9 weeks in, because it's clear that it's not ending. If I'm remembering, one of the devs, they even said that there were going to be veil like transcripts into next season, which tells me like how many of these things are there? Like, is it going to be one a week for the rest of the year or something? Like, I don't know, but
I mean, there's a lot of explain to, so they better get going. Yeah. Like I said, with the whole, we've only known about the veil since this year. They've definitely got a lot of catching up to do as far as building why we should care about the veil and why it's significant. There was one cool thing that you've mentioned about the Garden Progeny 1. That does seem to be some pretty cool foreshadowing in Curse of Osiris, which is what, 2017 or 18? No, it's 2017.
Yeah, it would have been technically very beginning of 2018, but even so, like, this was not, this wasn't Forsaken 2018. This was, it was like very early January,
early. I mean, obviously the expansion most of us have blocked out of our minds, but for that to be the first weapon, and it's the weapon that Osiris uses in the cutscene, which is pretty, I mean, it's a pretty bad weapon as in general, but him using it, we never really thought much of it, but the fact that it has of all the symbols, it's the one with the circle and the pyramid, and it obviously has the flavor text about two siblings carved apart. So it does very much seem like that was talking about, you know, the garden progeny, which is obviously the or would assume the witnesses' original race. So that does seem to be like, I always talk about, like, I enjoy when Bungie are able to plant a seed and then like 5 years later revisit it, as opposed to just shoehorning something and they thought of yesterday and being like, oh no, this was here the whole time. Like when they can, but obviously it's difficult to do, but when they can start a thread and then just years later just make it full circle and flesh it out and be like, oh, they'd hinted at that 5 years ago. That's always cool. So it seemed to be like that.
Yeah, I got to agree. Dropping in those the relevant story beats where possible, and then building them into something that is coherent and creates this really cool reveal however many years later, that's really neat. I honestly wish, though, and this is maybe a big ask over the entire thing, because, I mean, you know, we're going back a very long way at this point, but I honestly wish there was more of that across all of Destiny. Like, I really wish that we had this ability to sit there and be like, oh my god, they hinted at the Veil in every expansion at least once or twice, and we just never put them together. Like, and the cool thing is that we've seen this before, right? Like, the Curse of Osiris thing is one example, but even back in Warmind, just before Forsaken, Telesto and I want to say it's the Silver to Hamkara's Grasps released, and both of them were massive hints to the idea that Forsaken was going to release and Prince Aldrin was going to be at the center of the story and cayde was going to die. They never explicitly said cayde was going to die, but one of them, I believe it's the Silver to Hamkara's Grasps, told two truths and one lie. And one of them was literally light fades within the prison. And then you look at the Telesto, and its entire flavor text was this coded message from Paladin Orin, which is like an invented construct whenever the Awoken need to communicate something secretly. And it basically sat there and said, like, hey, we found Prince Aldrin. Like, we have
like,
him.
It described the cave, didn't it? Like the lost sector where he like crash landed into.
I mean, that's a totally separate thing, but yeah, no, that was in there as well. Like, you could see the Corsairs ship,
I think it was that one on Mars, where there was like, crashed, his ship landed on Mars somewhere in that lost sector.
Yeah, and the cool thing is they pull all of that into the lore, and like they clarify, like, this is how it got from Saturn to Mars and whatnot. Like, they explain all the bits and pieces. I mean, even then, like, Aldrin supposedly crash lands on a on something else on Mars and does a bunch of other different stuff, and then crashes a second time, which is where we find his ship. It's like, oh man, you really need to get better behind the joystick. You know what I mean? Like, goddamn.
Apparently he used to be good, but I guess not anymore.